Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to Geeks Not Nerds, the podcast. I'm Captain Logan.
And I am Vince.
And welcome to week 1 of our 5-week workshop on writing.
Indeed. All right, shop, I'm working.
We're gonna do 5 podcasts on writing in a row, and the reason we're doing this is because Vince and I get questions all the time on writing. People send us emails and ask us to look at their creative work and to help them out with things, to tell them what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, that sort of thing. And we thought people might appreciate a little bit of advice on writing, and we thought we would kind of give you some of our wisdom that we got in college. Basically, Vince and I both went to school for creative writing, and so we thought we would kind of regurgitate some of the stuff we learned.
Yeah, certainly the people at the University of Kansas won't mind us sharing what we learned from them.
Yeah, well, I don't remember having to sign anything that said, we won't tell anyone. It's not like jury duty.
I think it's on the diploma. If your name appears on there, it says, you are not allowed to repeat any of this information to anyone, especially if you're a professor.
Yeah, we've also both worked for the FBI now.
That's right.
So today, Vince, we're going to talk about just the basic fundamentals of writing. A couple weeks ago on a podcast, I brought up, hey, there are fundamentals of writing. You know what I mean? Basic stuff that any good story, no matter what it is, and this is not formulaic stuff. I mean, the thing that makes something a story versus something else. And I kind of quickly mentioned that just to back up some point I was making. And somebody left a comment and said, well, gee, Captain Logan, what are the fundamentals of writing? And so I'm going to tell you. We're going to tell you right here. Now, once again, some people may. I want to preface this by saying that there are probably going to be some people who will think, well, this isn't fair. You're telling me how to write. You know what I mean? You're telling. I mean, a lot of people go to school and have this problem. They're like, well, nobody can tell me how to write. Nobody can tell me how to be creative, and that's absolutely true. But the time, time tells all. Over time, as people have told stories, we have learned what makes for compelling storytelling and what doesn't. And this is kind of the modern conventions of writing. So I mean, by all means, if you don't want to use this stuff, don't. Write whatever you want to. But these are the things that are largely considered to be the modern conventions of writing. Again, this is the very basic stuff. We're going to talk about the basics of what makes plot and characterization work and that kind of thing. And this is the stuff that you need for any genre that you're telling.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing, whether you're doing science fiction or fantasy, or whether you're just doing straight air quotes literary fiction, which some people will tell you is a genre in and of itself.
Yeah.
You still should have this stuff, and you still are going to get a better story than if you're trying to bank solely on the things that make a genre a genre. That's when things get entirely too plot driven, and where characters end up stereotypical and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and we are talking about a complete story, a medium in which you can tell a complete story. We're not talking about skits or a campfire tale or something like that. We're talking about movies, novels, comics, whatever happens to comprise a complete story. A short story, these count as well.
Yeah, this stuff will you can no doubt use for whatever you happen to be working on. We wanted to kind of design this series for people who are writing whatever they want to be writing. I know people a lot of times will ask me things about how to write a movie script versus how to do a comic script, that kind of stuff. We may get into some of that stuff later on, either in this series or in something else. We don't have it built in, but we might touch on a little bit of that stuff. But for the most part, this is just basic storytelling. Whether you want to tell a story about some guy living out in the woods, or whether you want to tell a story about some guy living out in the woods who gets abducted by aliens.
How about a guy living with aliens who gets abducted by trees?
It doesn't sound promising, Vince, but
kind of a cross between Close Encounters and Lord of the Rings.
Right, and what was that? What was that Stephen King book about the writer who gets kidnapped in the woods?
Misery.
Misery, yeah.
I almost said The Shining because you said woods.
And throw some misery in there too.
Misery, because you're living in misery, as that old blues song says. That was a dumb joke. I apologize.
So once again, this stuff is it mostly applies. Well, it applies to everything, but I went to school and wrote largely short stories, and I would really advise people to give short story writing a shot, even if that's not generally what you want to do. Even if you're hoping to be a screenwriter or a comic book writer or whatever. Frankly, comic books are pretty much just serialized short stories for the most part, with art thrown in. You know what I mean? And movies very often, if they're feature-length films, are kind of like a novel on screen. You know what I mean? So we'll talk about this a little bit later. But first of all, I just want to say that if you're just starting out, I really advise people to start kind of small. Don't do that big, huge, giant, grandiose idea in your head before you've learned the rules.
You see, I started with. I did some short stories first, but I started largely with plays, and I find plays are a good place to start if you feel that you have a whole universe that you can explore. This limits you to a very small space.
It's a very minimalistic medium.
So I agree with Cap fully on this one. You start small so that you can grow from there, essentially.
A lot of times what happens is people, and I totally understand this. This is exactly what I did. I mean, this is normal. Everybody does this. But when I started, I think I've said this before. I had this giant sci-fi epic idea. You know what I mean? And what ended up happening to me is what happens to a lot of people. There were too many characters, and none of them were fleshed out. And it was too big, and I didn't know how to handle it. And so what's a lot better is start with a character, start with a protagonist, and learn about that person, grow with that person, figure out who this person is, build your plot around that person, make it small, minimalistic, and just because it's small doesn't mean it can't be wonderfully interesting. Those of us that are huge into comics and science fiction, we always want to do the big high concept piece. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
High concept being the big idea that you explore. You know what I mean? Let's throw out a really silly example. Click. Your high concept there is somebody finds a remote control that can control things. Not that I've seen that film, but I think that's what it was about.
Oh yeah.
So anyway, high concept things. That's not to say that there's nothing wrong with high concept, but the thing is, we get it in our heads that we have to come up with that concept that nobody's done before. Yeah. When what we really should be doing is writing something that expresses something about ourselves through a character. It sounds hokey, but the reason that works is because you're going to inevitably write something that has in some way or another, air quotes, been done before. But because you're doing it and you're and you're putting in your own 2 cents on things, you can do it in such a way where it feels new and different.
I mean, by no means should you try to go out there and say, I'm going to put my spin on Ender's Game. I'm going to write Ender's Game, but it's going to be different.
Right.
So we're not saying you should go out there and do that. We're saying that just because you have an idea that is in the same vein as something that's come before it, that you shouldn't necessarily count it as an old hat idea. And so the idea is that you go out there and you have this particular story in mind, and when you write it. What was it that you used to say to me, Cap? You said that you're not writing something original. You're writing something as if it is original.
Yeah. Really, when we talk about concepts, nothing is new under the sun, as the old adage goes. And so when you...
Especially not the Earth. That's been there for a long time.
Yeah, it's been around a while. People are still trying to decide just how long. And so if you're trying to write something, air quotes, original, the only way you can even come close to doing that is to do it in your own unique way. So you have to give it credibility. You have to have enough gumption to, and you have to know the rules. You have to know how the game works. And then what you do is you write something that looks original because you did it in your own way. So yeah, exactly. Nothing is original, but you can do it in such a way as if it were. So Vince, let's go ahead and go through just kind of the basic, the basic boring fundamentals of storytelling, and
prepare to be bored to death.
No, not at all. And again, we certainly don't mean to talk over anybody's heads, or to pretend as if we're talking over people's heads or be pretentious or anything like that. The idea here is this is for folks who have not heard this before, or possibly even for people who have but would love to be reminded of it. You know what I mean? I'll tell you this: I go back and reread old writing books all the time.
I find that beneficial.
Just to keep my mind in the writing world and remind myself how stuff works.
I think it's important to stay in practice. I mean, you look at concepts from the past and you say to yourself, "Oh yeah, that's something that I've been forgetting to do recently." Even so, even something as simple as making outlines for your stories. I mean, some people can sit down and just write something great just by pouring something out of their brain, but I'm not one of those people. So I have to sit down and make an outline. But
well, and it also depends on what kind of thing it is too. You know, some things are more thickly plotted than other things, and but we'll get to that when we get into the plot segment. Later on down the road. So Vince, I wrote out this outline, and you haven't seen it yet. But you know what I'm going to say. What is the first and foremost thing you need when you start writing a story?
A pencil and paper, maybe a computer if you're that high tech.
Story element wise.
Oh, well, there's certain things you need. You need a character. You need a scene, or not a scene. You need what do you call that? Setting.
A setting.
A scening. A setting. I did go to school. I promise. and you need supporting characters. You need plot points. You need. Well, there's a whole lot of things, really.
but of course, the first thing is your protagonist, and so here are the most important things about a protagonist. So the first thing about your protagonist is that you need to have somebody who is either proactive or becomes proactive.
Yeah, it's become a ridiculous trend in specifically in film, to my understanding, that characters are not proactive. They just have things happen to them, and that's where you get into the idea of a plot-driven film or a plot-driven book or whatever you have, because things just happen to this character, and now they get to whine about it for a while. Well, no, make your character go out there and do things.
People have made the argument to me that that you can have a protagonist where things just happen to them, because of course this is realistic. Sometimes you will have people who are not proactive, and that's the problem. And we'll talk about this. But what makes a story as opposed to just another day in this person's life is breaking of status quo. And a lot of times in a good story about a non-proactive character, the thing that breaks status quo is this is the day they decide to go do something. You know what I mean? You've got a non-proactive person who is sitting around on their couch all day long, and something compels them to go do something. Now we have story. If you have a character who doesn't do things, who just lets things constantly happen to them, it seems to me like you need a point where they go and do something. Or if not, and this is the other part of this point is of course, and we'll talk about this more at length in a second, that your character needs an opportunity for change at some point in the story. Sometimes when you get your opportunity for change, your character doesn't necessarily have to change. Your character's not always going to change, and so this might sound like a really boring story, but I suppose that means you could have a non-proactive character who has an opportunity to become proactive and then decides not to.
I had a professor, Kevin Wilmot, who always said, if you want to see a good example of that, see the movie HUD. And I've not seen it yet.
Right. So obviously you were really compelled to take this person's advice.
But when I say that, what I mean is a character who decides not to change. You see, the idea is that your character will have an opportunity.
Yeah.
And when you get that far, that your characters are not going to change, you need to have a good reason for why that person's not going to change. And the audience has to be able to buy that.
That's exactly right, yeah. And the reason that we need that opportunity for change is because this is realistic. This is what real people go through all the time. It's not about a character having to learn something necessarily. It's not, because a lot of times when I say opportunity for change, I'll talk to folks who will be like, oh, so that means that every story must have a moral. No, that's not entirely accurate. The point of having that opportunity for change is so that we develop characters, and so they go in a direction, so they're not just one or two dimensional. The thing that makes a character three dimensional is that they have that opportunity, because by seeing how they handle that situation, we learn about them. We see them grow, or we see them refuse to grow. And both of those are valid as long as you said as we buy it.
If you don't break status quo and you don't have an opportunity for change, what you have is a sequence of events.
Mm-hmm. You have a day in a life.
Yeah, you have the slice of life where just things happen, and then what's the point? I mean, personally, I don't really care to go.
It's not compelling. There's a time and a place for that, but like fiction is not what fiction is about.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange to me, the idea that you wouldn't want either of those in a story, because you need those in a story to make it a story, to make it a fiction story.
Yeah.
And, I mean, in my head, without those things, what you have is a series of explosions and sex in modern-day film, because those things would just overtake. That would be all it is, without those elements in the story to make us want to care about this particular character.
Yeah, and I think...
That's why they call it a character.
I think what you get into sometimes when you have a status quo not being broken and that kind of thing is experimental fiction, where what we're trying to do instead of actually telling a compelling story is just like show a piece of life, like you said, slice of life kind of thing. Show people either how things are or how they're perceived to be. And I suppose that's okay. I can see the validity of that, but I'm just saying, if you want to tell a story in the traditional idea of what a story is that goes all the way back to antiquity, there are certain elements you need. You need that opportunity for change. You need conflict in your story. The other big thing about your protagonist is that your protagonist must in some way be sympathetic. That's not to say that we have to like your character, but it just means that we have to care about what happens to them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you could have you can't have an unsympathetic protagonist. I mean, I suppose you could, but...
oh no, people try this all the time. Have you seen Clockwork Orange, Vince?
Yes, I have, actually. But if you have an unsympathetic protagonist, then you run the risk, not to say that this will happen, but you run the risk of people not caring to see the rest of your film.
Yeah, you run the risk of alienating your audience. Why do I care to watch this guy?
You had professor say to you, or a particular professor say to you, that you have to convince your reader to keep reading after the first paragraph.
Absolutely right. What he said, and I love this. What he always said at the beginning of the semester. I had him a couple times, and then he'd say this repeatedly. Is no one wants to read your story. No one cares. Everyone's writing stories. When someone picks up your story, it's either going to be because you're famous or because they were assigned to do that. That's a very cynical way to look at it, but it's also realistic. That's not to crush anybody's hopes and dreams or anything like that. It's just to say that that's largely true. And so the way you and maybe a better way to put it, put a little bit of a cap on it is. Nobody wants to read your story if they take a look at the first sentence and they don't care. And so we'll talk about this a little bit later too, hopefully, if we can get to it, about how important the first paragraph is. That's something that we talked at length, class periods upon class periods about when I was in school. But anyway, the point is, if your character, even barring just good writing, one sentence flowing into the next sentence, that sort of thing. If your character isn't somebody we care about, then what keeps a person reading?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I suppose the idea of being sympathetic. Your character can be generally unlikable, but you have to be able to sympathize with that person. Is their plight something that I can hang on to?
And do we buy that this person would have gotten to this place? It's not enough just to assume that there are bad people in the world, so I'm going to write a story about a bad person. Mm-hmm. People get to places in their life because certain things happen to them. It isn't that you necessarily have to have big flashbacks or give a whole bunch of background, but background certainly is important. And so if you have and this is hard to pull off, so I'm not condoning necessarily trying this, especially with your first story. But if you have a character, if you have a protagonist who beats his kids, for instance, first of all, if you make that guy sympathetic, I'm going to be very impressed with you. But more to the point, if your protagonist beats his kids, not your antagonist, not a supporting character, the person the story is about beats his kids, we have to somehow or rather appreciate this guy. We have to find a way to care about what happens to him. We don't have to condone his actions. We don't have to appreciate the fact that he's doing bad things. But we have to understand and believe that he got to this place, and B, believe that there's something redeemable, even if it's a very little thing.
If you make your protagonist just this horrible monster, a guy who's basically two-dimensional and would be a B-movie villain, for lack of a better term.
Right, he's a mustache twirler.
Yeah, he's just some evil man. Then he's not sympathetic. Nobody cares. And so why do they want to watch a movie about people getting beaten? Well, that's called sadism. So therefore, if you have a sadist in your audience, maybe you found your niche. But even with this particular character, who would be ridiculously hard to make sympathetic, you're not going to lead with that. That's not going to be your first step in your story. I mean, because then we still have the disruption of the status quo, and then we still have the chance for him to learn something. So,
or at least to change in some way.
Yeah. So he learns a new way of throwing that belt so that he can.
Well, that's not what we mean by opportunity for change. But yeah. But yes. But yeah. The So getting a little bit away from protagonist for a second. Of course, the thing that makes a story is conflict.
Right.
And as we said earlier, and of course, conflict is hugely important. Very often, conflict will be the thing that breaks the status quo.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a story where you have two characters that say, "Can I borrow that fork?" and the other one says, "Oh, by all means, I have 3 of them," then you have a scene that just ended.
Right.
So where are you going to go from there?
Right. And at the same time, if you have a character who says, "Can I borrow your fork?" and the other person says no, and they get in a fork fight, that's a weird story.
What, you've never been in a fork fight? I can relate to that.
But I suppose, I'm not going to say this is compelling conflict, but it is conflict. If you get in a fork fight, that's a problem. Here's the thing. No matter, this is something else that I had professors tell me. I love this too. You need to love your character. You need to love your protagonist, because you need to get in the head of that protagonist. So even if they're like a terrible, terrible person, or whoever they happen to be, or they're totally unlike you, or whatever, because not every character you write is going to be based on yourself. You need to love your character, but not to the point where nothing bad happens to them.
Yeah, I had a teacher once say, torture your characters. He said, just because you like your characters, just because you like your story, does not mean that you should put them in this fluffy world where everything has Nerf on the corners. I mean, he's saying go out there and make this character's struggle a real struggle.
Absolutely.
Don't make it easy on the guy, because of course, that's exactly what we're talking about, is conflict right here.
Yeah, well, here's something most of our listeners should be able to relate to. Why do people find Spider-Man to be compelling?
Because he has a lot of problems.
Because Stan Lee threw everything at him. Mm-hmm. And that's why he's an endearing character. This is a great example of how to make a character sympathetic, right? You got somebody like Peter Parker. He makes mistakes. He's not perfect. But the reason that we care about him, the reason he's endearing, is because all these bad things happen to him, and he remains proactive. He keeps trying to better himself. He keeps trying to. Not that every protagonist is going to better themselves. There are different degrees of types of people and what they're going to learn or try to. Or what their opportunity of change is going to be. But I'm just saying that with Spider-Man, the reason we care about him, even though he's this teenage kid who has to deal with all these regular problems, and he has to go out and fight supervillains and all that kind of stuff, is that he keeps struggling against adversity. He's got, and so we wouldn't care about him if nothing bad ever happened to him.
Yeah, and when we say love your character, I think that means that when you like your character, that means you've found something that you can relate to your character with. And if you can relate to your character, then either you're a child beater. No, I'm kidding. See, if you can relate to your character,
or you have at some point or another gotten in a fort fight.
So love your character. In other words, if you love your character, then it's likely that somebody else will love your character. Mm-hmm. And when you're writing your character, be sure to put on page why you like your character. I don't mean enter, this is why I like my character.
That's the title of my story.
I mean, show us why he is a guy that we care about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
so your conflict should be internal, external, or both. Naturally, there are different kinds of conflicts. You can have a very internalized character who's dealing with mostly internal problems that are somehow or rather reflect the external, that kind of thing.
A good example of that would be the Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and then of course you can have and then of course external conflicts would be a knife fight,
a fort fight,
fort fight. Excuse me, or just your obvious stuff, and of course feel free to be very creative with this. But things like you're a teenager and your mother grounded you for something, so you're stuck at home and you're supposed to be out doing something, or whatever your external conflict happens to be. And your conflict also can come in the form of an antagonist, and I think we should talk about this because stories don't necessarily have to have an antagonist. My favorite case in point for this is the worst Star Trek films have been the ones with a supervillain. When you've got the villain who is trying to get revenge on everything, and he's just there because, well, the movie needs some kind of conflict, and we couldn't come up with something better. You know what I mean? Not every conflict is going to be, and not every conflict that's a human conflict is going to come in the form of another person. Certainly, more of them will than not. And of course, your antagonist also doesn't always have to come off as an evil person.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the reasons X-Men was so interesting, because Magneto was sympathetic.
Your best antagonists are also sympathetic.
So if you care about you don't necessarily want your supervillains to win. And when I say supervillains, I'm also extending that to antagonists. So you don't necessarily want your antagonist to best your protagonist, but I think if you have a character who's truly interesting, that guy, that antagonist, is going to be somebody whose motives, while his methods are not necessarily pure, his motives have some sort of purity to them.
And again, don't feel like you have to be formulaic with everything you've ever read before. Outside of something like the superhero genre, sometimes the bad guys really do win.
Yeah.
And that is something to keep in mind. Sometimes your opportunity for change comes in realizing you've been beaten. Things like that. But again, don't feel like you necessarily have to have an antagonist if the conflict comes from something else. But generally, more often than not, even if you didn't mean to, someone will inevitably end up being the antagonist. Because after all, a lot of times problems come from, stuff that people do to other people.
Mm-hmm.
So your story, this is like the most important thing, okay? This is like the big fundamental thing. Once you've figured out what your protagonist is going to be.
Your protagonist has to have an eye patch.
and parrot is optional, but the eye patch is necessary. No, your story needs to be about a character. It needs to develop a character, and should not be about a political or social message. Because the thing is, if you sit down and say, I use this a lot. Vince heard me say this 100 times. You never want to sit down and write it and say, I'm going to write a story today about AIDS.
Yeah.
But you can write a story about a character who has AIDS, or a character whose parents have AIDS, or something like that. So my point is, don't not write about real things.
Yeah.
But real things come from developing a character, not from forcing them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, develop a character who develops a problem, and if you really want to talk about an issue, let that issue come forth through your writing. You may find that at the end of your piece, your overall point may have changed just because of the story you've chosen to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Or it might even be that you've given multiple sides of an issue and the story never comes down on it anywhere, and that's cool too. You really, again, you want to get in your character's head to make a character real. You've got to really explore that character in the story and make it character driven and not just plot driven, and certainly not just issue driven. And once again, that's not to say that you can't talk about things in your stories. You absolutely can. You absolutely should. But your story is not going to be compelling if the whole point of it is simply to tell someone to do something, to not do something, or to feel a certain way on a certain issue.
Yeah, sounds good. When you try to write something about an issue, you end up with something that's heavy-handed. And you don't want to beat your audience over the head with a club that says, you shouldn't like AIDS and we should do something about it, and then hit them in the head several times. It becomes cumbersome. It's annoying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, honestly, if you have a political agenda, there's just other things to do with it. I'm just saying. Your story is going to be a lot better if it's not just you venting, or if it's not just your your picket sign. And again, you can make points in stories, but people aren't going to find them interesting, enjoyable, relatable, etc., if that's all you do with them.
Yeah.
And this also extends to, and this is really important, this also extends to personal problems you might be having at the very moment that you write your story.
You may be too close to the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yeah, exactly. I mean, sometimes people write things that come off as just venting, as just anger, as just I hate the world and I'm writing about it, and it comes off a lot more stream of consciousness than they meant it to, or that kind of thing. If it hits too close to home, sometimes now is not the time. Sometimes you want to wait a little bit.
I mean, angst is not necessarily a compelling internal conflict.
No. And then, Vince, the last thing we should touch on is plot versus character. Plot is important. Character is more important.
There are movies that I've seen that try to weave intricate plots and then forget that the person that we're really interested in is the guy who's making this stuff happen. So, I don't want to cite any particular movies because, of course, then disagreements occur. But, or disagreeances, as the Urban Dictionary would have you say. But if you have a character who has a bunch of stuff happening to him, then you're forgetting that this guy is what's tying everything together. And if all this stuff is tied together with a person who's largely uninteresting, and you're trying to make your explosions more interesting, then you have a movie that is uninteresting. It may be pretty, but still.
You don't want your story to be just a bunch of stuff that happens, even if it's really interesting stuff, even if it's extremely well plotted, well thought out, that kind of thing. It's still not going to be as compelling as it could have been had you explored a character. Yeah. That's not to say that everything has to be an extremely intense character study. Okay, sometimes things are going to be more thickly plotted than other things. And it also will sometimes depend on the subgenre. Certainly, mysteries are going to be far more thickly plotted than other kinds of genres, and stuff like that. Sometimes even a romance will be a lot more thickly plotted than your average kind of action adventure kind of thing. But no matter what the genre is, if you want it to really stand out, you want to find a way to make your character real, and you want the plot to serve the character rather than vice versa.
Yeah, I agree.
But anyway, so these are just kind of the basic fundamentals of getting started, what makes a story, and I think that's about all I've got.
Yeah, we are much over time. Well, a little over time.
We are a little much over time. I think. I'm glad that we didn't stop too early. Otherwise, we would have had to waste the last couple minutes with a fork fight.
Much ado about forking.
Well, that's just weird. Anyway, so thanks a lot for listening to Geeks Not Nerds, the podcast. I'm Captain Logan.
And I'm Vince.
And we'll see you again next week when we'll be talking about we'll be talking a little bit more about characterization. We'll be really looking at what to do with your characters in your stories. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.